Good morning. This is the first class of my course, Spring Wildflowers, with code BPSC for Botany and Plant Sciences 031. In this first class, we're going to try to understand the development of plant taxonomy as a science and its correlation with the establishment of the foundations of the scientific method. So the origin of plant classification, the efforts done by humans to understand the richness and the diversity of the natural world, have many origins. It is quite likely that early farmers, even early gatherers in prehistory, were quite aware of the diversity of plants and of the similarities between some plants for different uses. The first proper use of plant taxonomy, or the first proper attempt to establish plant taxonomy as a science, was done by Aristotle, this person represented here, a Greek philosopher who used to spend his summers in the island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea. And he devoted his time to walking in tide pools and coastal lagoons, collecting organisms from the water and from land, and making an attempt to classify them. Aristotle's efforts were recorded in a series of books. The most important one of them was known as Scala Natura. He was a really acute observer of nature, and he really wrote very detailed writings on the anatomy and the morphology of organisms in the wild, and made an attempt to classify them. Although some of his classifications were quite good and taxonomically rigorous, he also established a rule that stayed until medieval times, which was plants are living things because they grow and they reproduce. Animals have another property, which is they have feelings. They can sense the environment and they can move. And then on yet another larger scale, humans are able to think. So he called this a scale of nature, from some living things that can grow and reproduce, but do not have sensitivity, do not have any feelings, to organisms that actually move, make decisions, and do have feelings, basically animals, and then humans on top of this scale that also have the ability to think. Aristotle's approach to the classification of living things remained during the whole of medieval times as a sort of hierarchical staircase that you can see illustrated here. A scale of intelligence with each step meaning one stage up. This is not Aristotle's. This is a very simplified and I would say fairly incorrect vision of what Aristotle imagined. So you have lapis, which is stones at the base of the scale, minerals, then flame, because flames in some way move, in another fire, in another step of the scale, then plants, then brutum, meaning animals, then homo, meaning human beings, and then the sky, the angels, and God. So this was basically the understanding of nature and the traditional teachings of how nature is classified and organized for almost 1,500 years, until some revolutionary new thinking started appearing in the 13th century. The 13th century had the eruption of some thinkers who challenged the traditional teachings of science and even of religion, and brought in new ways of thinking into Europe in particular. Both of them were Franciscan friars. You might know, or you might recall, that the order of Franciscan friars follows the teaching of St. Francis Assisi, whose main characteristic was his love for nature and his respect for all living things as part of the creation. So Franciscan friars had, from the very foundation of the Franciscan order, a love for nature, and they did concrete efforts to try to understand the natural world. Roger Bacon, not to be confused with Francis Bacon, who lived many centuries later, was a Franciscan friar and English philosopher in Oxford, and then he moved all over Europe with his teachings. He was a philosopher, and he founded a whole complex of methods known as empiricism, and he was one of the earliest advocates of the scientific method. Roger Bacon thought that scientific knowledge advances through experience, and especially through systematic observation and through well-designed experimental trials. He was a supporter of experiments to understand nature. He also believed that hypotheses and theories could be tested against observations of the natural world rather than relying on intuition or revelation. So he was the first one to bring this idea that you can make experiments in the natural world, and that the same experiments should yield similar results, or the same results if done with the same design. Some 80 years later, another Franciscan friar, also from Oxford, went around Europe, and he was put in jail, as a matter of fact, because of his thinkings. And he basically took Roger Bacon's ideas and expanded them more. His basic tenet is known as the principle of parsimony. He said, if you can explain something with simple scientific arguments, you should not try to explain it through complex hypotheses that cannot be put to a test. In Latin, his main phrase was frusta fit per plura, quod potes fiere per pausira. Do not try to explain with many arguments what can be explained in a simple way. William of Ockham's tenet, the principle of parsimony, started changing the way people thought about the explanation for scientific experiments. For example, if there are many plants that look the same, say the oaks of Europe, they all have acorns, they all have similar leaves, they all have similar wood and similar stems, you could assume that they have a similar origin, that they have a common origin, that they come from a common ancestor. That would be Ockham's simple explanation or simple hypothesis. You can imagine way more complex hypotheses, like, for example, they were created by some superior being, independently one from the other, and the superior being decided to design them with exactly similar seeds and similar flowers and similar leaves, but they do not have a common origin. According to William Ockham's principle of parsimony, the first argument would be way preferable because it assumes much less, a much lower number of hypotheses in order to explain what you observe in nature. So the teachings of these early precursors, Aristotle, Roger Bacon, William of Ockham, were gradually preparing the ground for an explosion in science that occurred in the 17th century and also in the 18th century, which was known as the Age of Enlightenment. An age around the world, or a period around the world, where suddenly science was taken seriously, and rationalism, the basic principle that natural phenomena have objective causes that can be researched, interpreted, understood and used to predict the way nature operates became the predominant way to understand life and nature in the world. The biggest exponent of the age of the Enlightenment in science um, was Sir Isaac Newton in England, who wrote a series of very, very important works, but basically summarized everything in this book known as Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which is known basically as the Principia, in which he wrote the sum of everything he had learned during his life about astronomy, about gravitation, about the way planets move, about the way physics operates in the earth, and about light, among many other things. So Newton is really the giant of the Enlightenment in science. But at the same time that Newton was writing his works in London, in England, there was this rather goofy character in the University of Uppsala in Sweden. His name was Carolus Linnaeus, and he basically loved going around in the short Swedish summer, collecting plants and trying to understand their nature and an accurate way of classifying the complexity and the diversity of life. Linnaeus realized that plants can be highly variable. For example, this is a modern example of a brittle bush, or a couple of species of brittle bushes, which grow very common in California, especially in the California deserts. And there are two species in Baja California. You can see here the cursor. One species on the left, which is Encilia ventorum, that lives in coastal dunes, very subject to wind and to wind erosion, and has these filiform, this thread-like leaves that tolerate very well the wind erosion. Then you have on the right of the image, the desert brittle bush that has sort of oval-shaped or heart-shaped leaves or deltoid-shaped leaves that are very hairy, covered with dense white hairs in order to prevent evaporation from the leaf in the desert. But in the area where the two species coexist or find each other, encounter each other, you get a whole gradient of hybrids according to the place where they're growing, which is the transitional area that has leaves that look intermediate between Ventorum and Encilia palmari, the one in the desert. Linnaeus was very quickly to realize that some morphological characters could vary a lot according to the environment where the plants grew. Being himself a researcher in Scandinavia, having traveled in Europe, he realized, for example, that willows in the Arctic tundra are dwarf, grow very, very low above the ground and die off during the harsh Arctic winter. But willows in Southern Europe or in Mesopotamia are big trees with really thick trunks and fairly high. But if you look at the leaves of the willows, they are the same. And if you look especially at the flowers, you realized that the flowers of the willows were the same in Scandinavia as they were in Southern Europe. So he realized that some characters, like the height of the plant, the size of the stem, or sometimes the shape of the leaves, change a lot between related plant families or between related plant groups. But he realized that there are other characters, especially the flower, the sexual parts of the plants, that are very invariable, he called them. They're very constant. They don't change from one plant to another. So he spent a lot of time making these type of illustrations that I'm showing you here, trying to understand the sexual parts of plants, because he believed that by understanding the shape of the flowers, he could find an objective way to classify plants in nature. We can find an example of this here in our own California ecosystems. This is a photo of one of the hills around Riverside during a spring flower bloom in California. And you can see basically two plants that grow very much the same. They're herbs. They're very soft herbaceous plants that live only for a few months. One has orange flowers, and this is the California poppy, the flower of the state, the official flower of the state. And the purple ones are the California lupine, also known as the arroyo lupine, which is very common around Riverside during wet, rainy springs. And they grow together, have a very similar life form. They're annuals. They germinate normally in January or February, and by March, April, they're in full bloom all around our mountains, and then they die off. But if you look at the flowers themselves of the lupin, you will realize that they're very, very similar to this tree here in the center that has nothing to do with the lupin. This is a desert ironwood, or the Arizona ironwood, which is a very long-lived desert tree with extremely hard wood. In its growth forms, it's completely different to the lupin. The lupin is an ephemeral plant. It grows only for a couple of months and then dies. This tree can live for 500-600 years. It's very slow growing and populates our deserts. But if you look at the flowers, you will see this is the flower of the lupin that has this structure here known as the keel, and has this structure here known as the banner petal. And if you look at the flower of the ironwood, it has almost identical flowers. It has the banner petal and the keel. The flowers are almost undistinguishable. They're so extremely similar. So for Linnaeus, what this was indicating is that the lupin and the ironwood are very related. He suspected that constancy in sexual characteristics is really what allows us to understand the relatedness of plants and not the general growth form. He realized that the lupin and the California poppy have a very similar growth form. They are ephemeral herbs. They live for a very, very short time, but they have completely different origins. So based on this, he started classifying plants according to their constancy of flower parts. And he used a system that was already being used in Europe at that time by using a noun and an adjective in Latin. Remember, Latin was the language of Europeans, the lingua franca, the international language of Europeans at that time, in the same way that the English language is nowadays. So he used two adjectives. First, a noun indicating the name of the plant, and then an adjective indicating the variations of that species. For example, at that time, the oaks were already well known because they were so important in Southern Europe for winemaking, to make casks, to also feed their pigs with the acorns, etc. And the big oak, the Southern European oak, was known as Quercus vulgaris, which, Quercus robur, which in Latin means the robust, the big oak. And of course, the oak that has a corky bark that was used to extract cork was known as Quercus suber, the cork-giving oak, and so on and so forth. So, for example, here's a page in which Linnaeus, in his publication, the Systema Naturae, classifies the beets. And one is Beta caulibus, which is the beet that has a stem. And then you can see here below, he has Beta rubra, which is the red beet we eat. Rubra in Latin means red. So he established this system that really already existed of understanding plants according to a noun that join together all plants that look very similar, like the beets or the oaks or the willows, and then putting an adjective to identify each one of the species. This very, very simple approach really brought a revolution in the way Europeans thought about science and nature. Linnaeus wrote all his ideas on classification of plants first, and then plants and animal in the world, in a book that started growing with each edition. The first one had only a few pages. The last edition was a massive treatise with many volumes in which he tried to classify the whole of the diversity of life on Earth. And it was called the Systema Naturae. And you can see here in which nature is divided into 3 kingdoms, and each kingdom is divided according to classes, orders, genera, and species. The Systema Naturae had a huge impact in European thinking, basically because it was based on a new method. What Linnaeus started by looking at sexual parts in plants became known as a comparative method. And with a comparative method, Linnaeus was able to separate 2 things that he called homology and analogy. And I'll explain a little bit more what this means. Homology, he called commonality of origin, or deep similarity, or similarity of structure, while analogy, he called commonality of function. Let me explain what this is. Think about, for example, the wing in a bat. Now, if we look at organisms with wings, insects have wings, birds have wings, and bats have wings. So they all fly. They're all flying animals. But if you look at the wings, they're quite different. The wings in insect is formed by chitin and has no muscles in the wing itself. The wing in birds is formed by flesh and bones, like that of bats, of mammals, but it has feathers that mammals don't have. And the wings in bats is formed, again, by flesh and bones, but what expands the wing and allows it to fly is basically skin very similar to the skin of human beings or any other mammals. And they have hairs, they don't have feathers. So Linnaeus realized that wings were really an analogy in these 3 groups of organisms. They had a commonality of function. They had the same function, but not the same origin. Now, if you make a careful dissection of the wing of a bat, you will see that it has the same humerus, the same radius, the same phalanxes that the arm of a human being has, or the front fin of a whale has. He realized that all these top limbs in humans, in herbivores, or in whales, or in bats, they all had a similar origin, although they might have similar, different functions. So the separation between the deep similarity related to origin and the superficial similarity related to function was extremely important and allowed him to group together correctly, for example, all the mammals together for the first time, or all the birds together for the first time, or all the insects together for the first time, independently of the fact if they swam or if they flew. For example, penguins and albatrosses suddenly were in the same group, although penguins are swimmers and they don't fly, and albatrosses fly incredibly long distances and they have very little ability to swim. It also allowed him to classify together bats with marine mammals such as sea lions or whales, together with herbivores such as antelopes, for example, or with predators such as lions or tigers. They were all classified within the same class of animals known as mammalia, mammals. And the concept of the comparative method was like incredibly revolutionary. It spread rapidly into other fields of science, such as linguistics, for example. People started understanding the evolution of languages according to the comparative method by comparing languages and figuring out commonalities of origin as opposed to commonalities of function. Archaeology, anthropology, geology, for example, some rocks that look similar, like for example, marble and obsidian, might be quite different really in their chemical composition. And so they have a commonality of function. They're used for the same thing, but their chemical composition is different. They don't have a commonality of origin. While, for example, marble and chalk, one is fairly hard, the other is very, very soft. They're both calcium carbonate. They have a commonality of origin, but they're not a commonality of function. So this changed in an incredibly rapid way, Linnaeus' findings did, the way we see the world, the way we understand common origins, and the way we understand the difference between deep form and function. Another revolutionary thing that Linnaeus did was to classify humans in the tree of life. This had never been done before. And I think he could get away with it because he was far deep in Uppsala in Sweden, removed from the Holy Inquisition and many other institutions that could question his approach to understanding the development and evolution of the human species. Here you have from the Systema Naturae, the group of the order of primates that are classified by, according to Linnaeus, to parallel teeth, superior teeth, the incisives that we have in front of our mouths that are large, and only two breasts up in the chest and not low in the stomach. So the position of breasts and the position, also the arrangement of teeth, was for Linnaeus one of the main traits that could be used to separate humans. You might argue that that is a simplification, that perhaps the way we use our hands or the ability to walk erect are more important. But really, he was able for the first time to put humans within other primates, within monkeys in general, into the tree of life. And you see here, he defines the genus Homo for humans, and it puts here, "Nosse te ipsum," know thyself, or learn about yourself, which is a call for scientists to actually learn about our origins and try to understand our origins. Linnaeus' thinking, although it went fairly unnoticed to the larger establishment in Europe, was rapidly taken by some scientists in London who established the Linnean Society of London, and in order to propagate and understand and disseminate the comparative method and the ideas that Linnaeus had about the diversity of life on Earth. Basically then, let me summarize here, Linnaeus' big revolution was founded in the development of rationalism during the Enlightenment and the comparative method. Rationalism, the founding idea of the scientific method during the Enlightenment, was based on the comparative science and controlled experiments, our ability to make controlled experiments. This is what allowed us to identify microorganisms, identify the causes of disease, and in general, understand the way the Earth works. The revolutionary approach of rationalism during the Enlightenment and the comparative method led to serious questionings of solidly established paradigms, such as the age of the Earth or the unchangeable nature of biological sciences. Thanks to Linnaeus' idea, for example, there was a chemist in England that calculated, he said, well, if the salt in the oceans is the result of dissolution of salt in the continents carried by, of minerals in the continents carried by rivers onto the, onto the sea, and if I know the flow of rivers and how much minerals they have dissolved in them, I can calculate the age of the Earth. And he did that, and he ended up with a first estimate of the order of 100 million years. And of course, that is way off the mark. We know now that the Earth is in the order of 3 billion years. But at that time, people thought that the Earth was not older than 4,000 years. So suddenly, using the comparative method, using experiments in the natural world, people were able to start questioning many of the established paradigms of knowledge about the world we live in. Finally, rationalism and the comparative method also demolished the anthropocentric view of the universe. The idea that humans are different from the rest of creation by simply placing Homo sapiens as yet another species in nature's tree of life. Linnaeus' revolution had already built into it, although Linnaeus never explored the idea deeply, of biological evolution. By talking about common origins, by saying all the oaks have a common origin, or all the beans have a common origin, or all the willows have a common origin, or all the cats in the wild, lions, tigers, have a commonality of origin, what he called commonality of origin. It was assumed that they descended from a common ancestor. This idea was well developed in Europe by the time of Linnaeus' death. Everybody accepted this idea and developed it more. Lamarck, the great French scientist, was one of the first serious proponents of the theory of evolution to understand the diversity of plants, on plants and animals, of the diversity of life on Earth. But none of them was able to come up with a credible argument. How did species form? How did different related species develop from a common ancestor into separated biological entities? And it was this guy here, Charles Darwin, who was the first one to crack the nut, to be able to solve the conundrum, together with Alfred Russel Wallace, an English biologist who was in Malaysia collecting plants and animals for British museums at that time. And Darwin published this incredibly influential paper in 1858, already towards the end of the Enlightenment. He's probably one of the last representatives of the Enlightenment, on the tendency of species to form varieties and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection. He came up with this idea of natural selection, which is if individuals, populations, subpopulations of a single species are put in different environments, they will adapt to that environment simply because the organisms that are most successful in that environment will leave more offspring. So if you put the same willow, to go again to the example of the willows in the Arctic, the ones that grow lower and can survive the strong Arctic freezing winds are going to survive more than the ones that are taller. But if you put them in the Mediterranean coast or in Mesopotamia, which is very hot, the ones that can go high above the ground and outcompete other plants and create a lot of shade below are the ones that are going to leave the most offspring because they will develop big canopies that produce a lot of seed. So two populations of the same species put in different environments will diverge. That was Darwin's great idea. And that he called is natural selection, because organisms survive differently in different environments. And after a sufficiently long time, after deep time, if you put them again together, they probably will be reproductively isolated. They are so different in shape, form, growth habit, and sometimes also in DNA and chromosomal characteristics, although Darwin didn't know that at that time, that will not be able to hybridize again, and they will have formed two different species. This is the first tree of life, the first attempt written by Charles Darwin in one of his notes. If you look up here, it has the words, I think. Basically, Darwin wrote with some speculation that he thought that this is the way life evolved. From a common origin, it would diverge into different branches as the populations of the different species were put in separate environments and eventually produce a number of different populations, so different that they would be considered new species. So basically, Darwin suddenly put into Linnaean plant taxonomy a strong explanation. The species, what we know as species, what Linnaeus recognized as species with those funny Latin binomials, are really the result of natural selection in the wild and deep evolutionary time, the passing of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years that allow for populations in different parts of the world to adapt to their own environments and to develop their own characteristics and diverge from the ancestral population. Finally, and we are approaching the end of this first class, I need to mention this person here, a monk in a monastery in Austria by the name of Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk. Gregor Mendel was a gardener in the monastery, and he loved planting different plants and experimenting with them. And he started experimenting with peas. And they loved eating the European green peas. I love them too myself, they're really nice. And he saw that they have different traits. For example, some peas had rounded seeds, while others have rugose or dented seeds. Some peas had yellow seeds, while others have deep green seeds. The flowers, some peas had purple flowers, while others had white flowers. The shape of a pod, some peas had inflated pod and constricted pods. The pod color, it could be yellow or green, and even the growth form of the plant. Some plants have flowers below the apex in what is known as axial positions along the stem axis, while others had terminal flowers on the top of the apex. And the plant height, some peas are tall, other peas are dwarf. And he started testing them by making crosses of peas with different traits and see what happened. And he saw, for example, if you cross spherical peas with dented peas, all the descendants, what he called the F1, the first generation, is spherical. But then if you cross the first generation again with each other, they start segregating some dented peas and some spherical peas again in a proportion of 3:1. And he calculated the binomial distribution of this and figured out that that inheritance is controlled by discrete units that he called genes, known as genes. And he established the science of genetics. He realized that there were discrete units. At that time, he didn't know what those units were. That were transmitting inheritance from the parent generation to the offspring generation, and that each individual had genes from the mother and from the father in equal proportions. This opened the doors to the science of genetics, really still to this day, a rapidly exploding area of science. Since then, we have identified chromosomes first, and then we have identified ways to analyze the DNA, and we can sequence the DNA of organisms, and we can know exactly what are the genes that make these traits. I'm not going to go into any detail in this because that would be the content for another course. But what is important here is that the science of genetics and genomics is now rapidly affecting also the way we understand plant taxonomy. In the past, we used attributes such as the shape of a flower, what Linnaeus used, the shape of a flower, the type of fruit, uh, different attributes to classify plants into related families. Now, of course, with our ability to make fast sequenciation of DNA, we can use the DNA itself to understand commonality of ancestry, to understand common ancestors. We can analyze the DNA in different chromosomes and find out what part of the DNA is common to two species and really figure out how related they are. So now we are in the middle of a rapidly changing, explosive transition in plant taxonomy, in which most of the traditionally morphological Linnaean plant taxonomy is being revised according to DNA. Fortunately, there are not huge changes. Morphology, at the end of the day, is a result of the DNA in the plant's chromosomes. And so we will base our course in plant morphology, the traditional way of approaching plant taxonomy. But you should be aware that we are living a revolution in plant taxonomy through the use of DNA.